Welcome everyone to a webinar entitled Transhumanism and Transcendence, What Are We Becoming? Presented by Sister Ilia Delio with a response from Nicholas Sparks. My name is Sebastian Mahfood and I am the Director of ITEST. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, ITEST, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Before I introduce our presenters, Sister Marianne Postiglione, a religious sister of mercy, will open us in prayer. Sister Marianne is on the ITEST Leadership Council and is senior editor of the ITEST Bulletin. Sister Marianne?
Thank you, Sebastian. Most Holy One, we adore you and praise you as our triune God. Shower your energy, love, and wisdom on our presenters today. You have given them gifts of mind and intellect according to your design. They have used their God-given talents to explore the mysteries and beauty of the human and the challenges and the promises of the transhuman. Help us as hearers of the word that their words through you will enlighten our minds and intellects. We await the day of our transformation in the glorified body, that eye has not seen nor ear heard what God has prepared for those who love him. Truly, Lord, what are we becoming? We ask this in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Marianne. So before we begin, let me explain the chat feature. Those of you who are familiar with Zoom will know that you can click on your chat button and it'll open chat on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can see the posts that people will make. You can make posts of your own. You can ask questions as they occur to you over the next hour and a half or so of our presentations. And we will use these during the Q&A period. You can also have sidebar conversations with one another if you know how to do that. So those of you who are in this presentation who are not speaking, namely the participants or the audience members, please remember to keep your microphones muted during that time so ambient noise doesn't come in. And if you wish, you may also turn off your video. And to mute your video, it's right next to the mute the audio button. So with that, I will begin my introduction of our first speaker. I am delighted to introduce Sister Ilia Delio, a Franciscan sister of Washington, D.C., who holds the Josephine C. Connolly Chair in Christian Theology at Villanova University. Her area of research is science and religion, with interest in artificial intelligence, evolution, quantum physics, and the import of these for Christian doctrine and life. She is the author of over 23 books, including Making All Things New, Catholicity, Cosmology, and Consciousness, a finalist for the 2019 Michael Ramsey Prize, and The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, God, Evolution, and the Power of Love, for which she won the 2014 Silver Nautilus Book Award and a 2014 Catholic Press Association Book Award in Faith and Science. She is founder of the Center for Christogenesis, an online educational resource for promoting the vision of Teilhard de Chardin, and a fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion. Without further ado, I present Sister Ilia Delio. Sister, take it away.
Thank you, Sebastian, and good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be with you this morning to share some ideas and maybe some challenges on transhumanism and our interaction with technology in our own becoming. So let me begin with a set of slides to help us get on the way here. Hopefully you can all see the slides. If you can't, just scream out now so we can, but I think you can. So I hope so. I see a smile from Nicholas. That's a good sign. So the subtitle here is, what are we becoming? So we are in a process of change, and certainly a period of rapid change from the late 20th into the 21st century. This term transhumanism actually has its roots in Christianity, precisely because of the faith claims of the Christian faith claims of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. So the first written appearance of the word transhumanism is really found in Dante's Divine Comedy. And he coined this word transhumanar to describe the glorious transformation that awaits us as we're taken up into this eternal presence of God. So for Dante, the transhuman means to go beyond, something that cannot be described in words. Sort of following the Pauline notion that eye has not seen, nor ear has heard, nor has it entered into the heart of us all that God has prepared for those who love him. And that is, in a sense, always been the Christian promise that, we are those who follow, this path into God through the footsteps of Jesus, in a sense, are on this path of becoming a new type of person. And so, just as a heads up, transhumanism will have its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition, believe it or not. Now, interestingly, if we go back to the Middle Ages, transcendence was always at the heart, becoming, this reaching beyond, this kind of transhumanism trajectory. So sort of at the heart of even medieval mysticism. Certainly, the medieval worldview had this view of the cosmos with a spiritual sphere and a physical sphere. So there was this notion that this macrocosm held a space for mystery, a space for the soul to transcend itself. Even as the psalmist wrote, when I look at the heavens and the moon and the stars which you have arranged, who are we that you keep us in mind? This kind of longing for something more that we perceive beyond ourselves. Of course, modern science, with the rise of, beginning with the heliocentric shift in the late 14th century, and then we'll see in our own time a new emergence of Big Bang cosmology. As science emerged as an independent discipline, a discipline separate from, in a sense, certainly separate from theology, and in some ways moving away, from classical philosophy, it brought with it a conquering of space, primarily because science began to name everything. And as science began to name and measure and quantify things, we move from this kind of transhumanism, which is kind of caught up with final causality, that which we long for, to efficient causality, God, and therefore we could explain, how the sun moves or how the planet moves from A to B. And therefore, the notion of God as a first cause or creator was pushed out of the cosmos as an unnecessary hypothesis. And I think this rise of modern science that began to, we might say, separate religion from the physical world was furthered by René Descartes and his longing for a unity of knowledge in a changing world. But Descartes really separated the mind from the material world. And so his famous dictum, I think, therefore I am, really placed the notion of the thinking self in a primary position over and against, you might say, the material self. So the body became like this, just a material entity, a res extensa, this just stuff. And the soul became the important thing, the thinking self. And so body and soul were considered really kind of two distinct entities held together by the creator. And for Descartes, that locus of intersection, even as the physical person, would be in the pineal gland. Interesting in that description. And I do think it's with Descartes much more than with the ancients, who really did have kind of a physical sense of the whole between spirit and matter. With Descartes, we do get this kind of dualism that enters in, this break-off between body and soul. And of course, this kind of separation really did have, you might say, repercussions. We find after the rise of Cartesian philosophy, a much greater emphasis on empiricism, the conscious turn to the subject. In other words, there's really, the only way I can know the world is if, in a sense, I, begin to experience it, to impose, the structures of my own thought on the world. So this kind of stripping of the world of mystery and the stripping of the world of any kind of transcendence was really typical of the 17th and 18th century. There was the quantifiability of matter, again, left no room for any other kind of space to existence. Mind became separate from matter, and therefore we have, with the rise of Newton's laws of gravity and motion, this notion of a mechanistic framework or this clockwork universe, where matter was inert. You could do with it what you will, slice it, dice it, build it up, chop it apart. But the only thing that really, the spirit or the soul was just, and the mind was separate from this. And so this machine world, of course, was very attractive to us because a machine has replaceable parts, it has controllable parts. And so I think a lot of our modern world was built as a mechanistic or a Newtonian world, where when the parts wear down, you just replace the part, and the big machine just keeps on humming. But that did not work well because there's something about the human person there's a spiritual nature, there's a soul nature that really longs for something more. And when that moreness cannot be found in the universe, it's problematic. And so the advent of modern science, and by modern science, I mean the emergence of significant paradigm shifts in the early 20th century, certainly in the area of cosmology and physics, has really brought about a new understanding of things. Of course, the theory of evolution that emerged in the 19th century was very challenging for faith because it seemed to have dispensed with God as creator, since we could now explain the mechanisms of biological life from within the material world. Big Bang Cosmology also now put a new challenge to the area of faith. Of course, the Big Bang cosmos emerges around the turn of the 20th century with Einstein's theory of general relativity and special relativity. Two things that are important here is that we began to realize that matter is not inert, that matter is really a form of energy. And so that what we call matter is, in fact, matter is rather elusive. When you get down to the realm of quantum physics, it's really just a realm of complex relationalities, energy relationships. The other thing I thought that relativity shows us is that there's no such thing as absolute space and absolute time. That matter is, you might say, the unfolding of space, and time is the experience of movement. So it's not space and time, it's space-time. In fact, the term that's used today is space-time mattering. It's kind of all one continuum of unfolding reality. So this world of energy, I think, has significant importance for us because the realm of quantum physics was a significant breakthrough, certainly leading us beyond Cartesian dualism, insofar as there seemed to be a new role for the mind in the material world. And this is largely coming out of the Copenhagen School of Niels Bohr, where scientists realized that particles in space cannot adequately be determined without the fundamental role of consciousness. And so quantum physics ushers in a new understanding of mind and matter. And that, coupled with evolution, has really pushed us into a new understanding of human personhood. Something is here that's dynamic, something that is changing, something where consciousness plays a fundamental role in what is emerging. So this notion of the person has really taken on new meaning, certainly with modern science. We're not a given. We don't just up here, and we're not static. I think anyone who, if you're around Earth, as long as I've been around Earth, you know that life is not static. So the human person emerges, and this term emergence really refers to that life is an ongoing process of novelty, of complexity. It's got this aspect of fluidity to it. And yet this human personhood is constantly a set of dynamics that continues in its interaction with the world and the culture of that world. The Lutheran theologian Philip Hefner writes, personhood is achieved through our acting upon the physical, biological, and cultural materials that we have inherited to establish a center of identity that shapes those materials into an understanding of the self and an understanding of the self's relation to the world. So it's a dynamic concept of personhood. And what we begin to realize is that the mind plays a significant role in this unfolding of human life. Again, this term panpsychism is one that is more and more in the literature today because there is growing consensus that consciousness may be primary to matter. And therefore, this mind matter, mindful matter, if we can use that language, is in a sense what marks this process of evolution. It is not simply the fact that we are emerging out of lower life forms. Rather, there's something else going on. There's a direction, for one thing, to evolution, even though that is contested among many evolutionary scientists. But the Jesuit scientist Teilhard de Chardin said that evolution is the rise of consciousness. And that's a very interesting insight in light of transhumanism. Now, why transhumanism? Well, let's take it this way. In the mid-20th century, 1950, at the end of two world wars, and here we're at the end of World War II, the Korean War, the 20th century was a world of utter destruction, utter violence. And there was a need to go beyond ourselves. Is this it? That would be the question. Are we just a violent species who will eradicate ourselves, or do we have a way to continue on in what we are in a more maybe an enduring way, a life-giving way? Alan Turing developed this very simple test in 1950. He was a cryptologist and mathematician. Basically, Turing said, look, if I put a computer in one room and I put a human person in another room, and here I am, the interrogator on number C, and I give the same question to the computer and this human person, and if I get answers back and I can't tell the difference between the answer from the computer and the answer from the human person, I may assume that the computer is thinking like a human person. And that became the basis of what we know today as artificial intelligence. And so the Turing test really was kind of coupled with other developments in science. One of them, so if Turing was working in 1950s, the term artificial intelligence itself was coined in 1956. And then in 1960, we have now space travel. So not only are we experimenting in the 50s and 60s with extending human intelligence or human mind now into machines, now we could strap machines to humans, and we can extend human life from terrestrial life to life in outer space. So this term cyborg, it's an acronym for cybernetic organism. And therefore, a cyborg is a human who has certain physiological processes like breathing, muscle movement, that are aided or controlled by mechanical or electronic devices. So a cyborg signifies a hybrid of biology or machine and animal or device. And therefore, the cyborg as a symbol of human personhood became significant in the 70s and 80s. People like Donna Haraway began to realize that boundaries now can be changed. And so Donna Haraway, one of the early feminist philosophers, wrote an incredible piece called The Cyborg Manifesto on science, technology, and social feminism in the late 20th century. Haraway was one of the first to realize the implications of the cyborg for understanding human personhood. Basically, she said technology is not neutral. We're inside of what we make, and it's inside us. We're living in a world of connections, and it matters which ones get made and unmade. And that is very true. In other words, this notion that technology is simply a tool that we use has with it a certain philosophy of understanding human personhood. And basically, Haraway was taking the implications of technology philosophically. In other words, it tells us about what we are and what reality is in its core. And so what Haraway's cyborg really holds out for us is that we are moving beyond biological essentialism, that the notion of the cyborg means the lines between mechanical and biological life are being increasingly erased. And this in turn changes how we think about ourselves in relation to one another and the way we think about our own identity, gender, race, and the many things that define human personhood today. So three terms that actually belong together. Cyborg, in terms of this hybridity between human persons and machine or device, is corresponded with the mathematics or the systems of cybernetics, a term that was coined by Norbert Wiener and others in the 50s to speak about how information flows. And cybernetics is related to complexity. Complexity is a theory or an area of mathematics that, in a sense, is about branching and developing more interrelatedness. So all of these things, cyborgs, cybernetics, complexity, meaning that the human person now is not just a static, isolated entity who can create a tool to use. Now, using the motto of cybernetics, we create the tools and the tools create us. That's what we mean by this cybernetic feedback, that there is something that is taking place in this relationship with our devices, with technology. I think this scene, which is, you can see a little bit dated by the phone. This is obviously not a 5G phone. But we can see that our world today is governed by computer technology in basically every facet of life, considering even that we're having this webinar or this seminar on technology. And it's a question, why are we so lured and enamored by our technologies? Certainly our cell phone technology. I always tell people when I was growing up in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, our phone was on the wall with about a 3-foot cord. And I remember when people said they were going to create a cell phone you carry around in your hand, and I said, that's impossible. And by the late 70s and 80s, there it was. Then someone said, they're going to put a computer in a cell phone. And I said, well, what's a computer? So all of this has really happened and taken place at a very rapid speed. So one of the insights of technology, certainly from Gordon Moore, a founder of Intel Technology, is that technology accelerates not linearly, but exponentially. And we have been on this exponential trend of advancing technology since the late 20th century. And here we are sort of on this trajectory. This is kind of a cartoon of our development, but it has been a very rapid development from the old cell phone into the modern 5G. And I can rest assure you that in another 10, 15 years, our cell phones will become obsolete as we continue to implant or cyborgize ourselves with implantable chips and other types of what we might call mental communication. So what's the lore here of technology? One thing I think is that cyberspace, which is that space of infinite bits, has replaced the medieval cosmos, quite honestly. If the medieval person could look out on this expanse of heaven and begin to imagine and to feel drawn beyond oneself, and that collapse of the physical space with modern science has been replaced now by a new space we call cyberspace. Basically, you can be anything and find anything you want in this infinite space of imagination and creativity. Brett Robinson, in his book Appletopia, begins to look at Apple computers as a new type of spirituality. And Robinson claims in that book that the loss of transcendence in the modern age has been renewed by technology. And in his view, the sacred has been relocated to subjective experience. He speaks of the Apple Store as the new cathedral that people gather in, on Sundays. I'm not sure I buy that entirely, but, it's an interesting and provocative type of idea. He says that technology, like religion, is the place where the physical and the metaphysical can meet. And included is this painting by Parada, Hispanic artist, where the computer is the new Jesus, so to speak, and Steve Jobs is the new Messiah, and the kind of new apostles are Andy Warhol, and it looks like Walter Cronkite there with John Lennon, Imagine There's No Heaven, singing in the background. So you can see culture, technology, and the lures of transcendence meeting in this painting. One of the maxims of transhumanists is that technology will fulfill what religion promises. And that, when I read that, that woke me up to really say, well, what is going on here in technology that is such a dramatic lure for us? This term cyborgization just is this process that we've moved from the phone on the wall to the phone in our hands, now to merging. We have Fitbits and we have wearable devices, to implantable devices, to the fact that we will be eventually fused between biology and technology. So this leads us into then the discussion on artificial intelligence and transhumanism. What are the aims? What are the aims here? Where do we think we're going with this? So there are basically two artificial intelligence trends. And I'm going to distinguish them as philosophical trends. One is transhumanism, or the enhancement or perfection of the human person by means of technology, meaning that we are persons in transition, or as one computer guy said, biology was never our destiny, chips are our destiny. The other is posthumanism, that does not look at the radical erasure of humans, but the reconfiguration of the human in relation to culture and environment. So let's just briefly look at these. Transhumanism is a term that refers to technologies that can improve mental and physical aspects of the human condition, such as suffering, disease, aging, and death. It was coined in 1996 by Nick Bostrom and David Pearce at Oxford. And basically, it kind of revives the Renaissance idea that we humans can wrest our biological destiny from evolution's blind process of random variation, using science and technology to overcome our biological limits. So we will reverse cellular aging, we'll reverse the death limit, the death barrier. Transhumanists want to, in a sense, have extended lives. And basically, that's the goals of transhumanism. We can live longer, happier, smarter, with more control over our lives. We can have a more democratic and peaceful coexistence. And it's kind of this superhuman idea that we can we can go beyond, what we are to a betterment. And this human betterment really, and this is one of the aims actually where a lot of research money, believe it right now, is being poured into digital immortality. You may have heard of brain downloading, that we can download the brain. If you've seen the movie Transcendence with Johnny Depp, you know that we can live on by downloading our minds into chips, and therefore we'll have beams. So we have genes for our biological life and beams for our artificial intelligent lives, like basic components of memory. So Ray Kurzweil, one of the chief engineers here, posits that by 2045, so that only gives us about maybe 23 years, we will be so merged with our technologies, we will have exited Homo sapiens and become true techno sapiens with digital immortality at our disposal. Hans Moravec, a computer science was at Carnegie Mellon, said intelligent machines will provide humanity with personal immortality by mind transplant. And it seems so incredible, but so did the cell phone, quite honestly. So here's the thing. I think one thing we have to just acknowledge is that we humans are an emerging process of biological life. Transhumanists see our goals with technology as achieving a new teleology, an up ahead, a goal of superhumanity, superintelligence. It has this within it, this idea of the kind of Nietzschean idea that knowledge is power. You will be able to know, our human brains, obviously, they're worn out by so much information today. So we need kind of technological devices just to help us to keep going. We'll have a better will to power. And therefore, radical transhumanists just see the body as a support system for the mind. I think it's kind of Cartesian dualism at its best or worst. Posthumanism is a different type of trend. And here I'm taking posthumanism as a philosophical trend espoused largely by feminist philosophers. They see that technology is leading us to a new type of personhood, but it's more of a cyborg or a hybridization, so that our knowledge, our knowing things, is being now extended into our devices and then playing back with us. So a kind of a reflex epistemology. So for posthumanists, cognition is being distributed in and through our devices and technologies. And so they see technology as a form of extended embodiment rather than a replacement of embodiment. So the posthuman, as Catherine Hales in her fabulous book, How We Became Posthuman, written in 1999, says the posthuman does not mean the end of humanity, which is, I think, a slightly positive sign. It signals the end of a certain concept of the human as an autonomous being, exercising one's will through individual agency and choice. What we might call the Western man or the Vitruvian man, the person of the autonomous liberal subject. And so that's basically what posthumanists say. We're at the end of the modern liberal subject. Let me see if I hear. Catherine Hales writes that the unpredictable nature of complex dynamics implies that subjectivity is emergent rather than given, distributed rather than located solely in consciousness. Now, this is an interesting insight that touches upon the way that not only technology, but the technology building on the basic insights of quantum physics, that it is deep relationality all the way down, and that space-time itself is an emerging phenomenon. So Hales writes, in the post-human, there are no essential differences or absolute demarcations between bodily existence and computer simulation, cybernetic mechanism and biological organism, robot technology, and human goals. So that's the key. There are no essential differences. Basically, she's saying that what we are is now extended into our devices, into our computer simulations. And of course, she sees this as a cybernetic mechanism. As we create these things, as we extend ourselves into them, we are being changed by them as we change them. Let me see, there we are. So Hale says this post-human trajectory means dismantling the centered, masterful subject as an affirmative project, ending not in the absence of the subject or its incorporation into the body of nature, but a new and positive concept of social subjectivity. And so, again, another way to say this is we're moving from, and I would put it this way, we're moving from the isolated individual or the self-subsistent individual to a new type of hyper-personalization. And this kind of hyper-personalization really corresponds to a movement in philosophy today known as the new materialisms. Now, again, the new materialisms is building on the insights of quantum physics and the way quantum physics has radically altered our fundamental understanding of nature. So the term was coined by Manuel Delanda and Rosi Braidotti in the second half of the 1990s, although its roots are in the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. What are they saying here? One, it's panpsychic. Mind is always material. We can never really talk about matter apart from mind. And anyone who can, I'd love to hear more from you. Matter is always something of the mind, right? You cannot extract consciousness. You cannot extract mind from matter. So nature and culture are always nature cultures. These are, rather than separate, distinct entities, they are hybrid entities. They are cybernetic entities. So Deleuze, I just want to make sure okay, good. Deleuze says that the subject is a folding in of external influences and a simultaneously unfolding outwards of effects. Again, the subject is not a given, not a static entity, not a substance that is unchanging, but rather one who is influenced by the outside influencing the inside influencing the outside. So this interior, exterior, subject and object, individual, social, and symbolic are co-constitutive instead of predetermined. And I guess that is one of the insights from quantum physics that shows up in technology and continues in this philosophy of new materialisms. This idea of co-constitutivity, that there's a co-creativity that's taking place, precisely because matter is a transformative force in itself. Matter is not static and inert. So this has given rise to the fact that even agency is shifting. What Guattari calls transversality, that agency cuts across or intersects in two ways. It's not just the human person being agent in a material world. The material world has its own sense of agency itself. And this has been brought about largely through the philosopher and physicist Karen Barad, who wrote a very provocative book in 2007 called Meeting the Universe Halfway. And in that work, Barad really speaks of a new term. She calls it a gentle realism. And she says, matter feels, converses, suffers, desires, yearns, and remembers. All designated things are constantly exchanging and diffracting, influencing, and working separately. So rather than a world of just a mechanistic world of stuff by which the human agent is controlling the stuff, now we find ourselves in a world of co-constitutive relationships with the material existence, where mind is playing a fundamental role in that existence, and mind is being extended and changed by the very devices we engender. So what Barad says is what is pre-existing today is relations, from which relata, that which relates, emerges. She says something does not first exist and then relate. Rather, relationships are formative of existence. Of course, this touches now, this moves us metaphysically from a metaphysics of substance to a metaphysics of becoming, where relationships hold primacy. And she says agency is not a center of action. Agency is a center of relationships. Agency is not what something does, it's what something is. Therefore, she sees agency as mutual, bilateral, and consistent with the operations of complex dynamical systems. Of course, this has implications for transhumanism, even as we develop robots, as we develop, as we continue to extend ourselves into computerized devices. Agency, she's saying, is shifting here. So what Barad and others are saying is that we are the world in its ongoing changes, reconfigurations, dynamics, production of meaning and entities, and the world takes shape through our actions, what she calls interactivity. So she says, knowing and being are mutually related. We know because we're part of the world, and we are part of the world as we know, and as we know in this differential becoming. We become, in a sense, who we are as persons, and the world becomes that which is other than we are, precisely because of our interaction with matter. So we're calling this, and what philosophers call this today, is a turn to matter, or a new materialist ontology, where not entities, not things, but relationships hold primacy. Not agency, but effects of those relationships that impart agential action. Not structures, but assemblages. Things are constantly forming and then reforming. So it's not about construction, but production. And therefore not about textualities, but matter itself. Maybe put this another way, matter really matters in a post-Einsteinian universe. And mind plays a significant role in what matter becomes. The Italian philosopher Rosi Brodati speaks of the nomadic subject, this perpetual becoming she writes about, that kind of makes us thinking about the present, makes us also confront the conditions we inhabit. So, in other words, this nomadic subject is one who is constantly engaging the material world, a process of being and becoming, an interplay between what's actual and the present as the virtual, or what can be, spells the rhythm of subject formation. So the post-human is really a nomadic subject interacting with technology, becoming something more transhuman. And yet the question is, what is it we're becoming and toward what? The post-human subject is a materially embedded, nomadic entity engaging in interrelations with human and non-human agents, just as we're doing right now, interacting with our computers. And it's a question, again, as we are interacting with them, it's a process that, in a sense, even the information that we're receiving makes a difference in our own thinking process. So we're always in a dynamic process, in a sense, always ceasing to be and always in the process of becoming. This does lead us, of course, philosophically from, if we wanted to talk about philosophy and metaphysics, certainly away from an Aristotelian notion of matter or a Thomistic kind of theology underpinning things here, to a process theology that was espoused by Whitehead and Hartshorne in the 20th century, where ideas of becoming, unfolding, emergence, and experience really do, in a sense, reflect what we know from modern science today. And yet it is a question, where is God in all of this, right? What are we becoming? And I think that is one of the downfalls, quite honestly, of the rapid trajectory of computer technology that we have bought into lock, stock, and barrel, quite honestly. We've all run out to Best Buy to buy our phones and our new computers. And we can't just keep, placating this as saying, well, they're just devices to help me. No, they really are changing us. And we really need to take hold of that. And so the question is, toward what? What are we doing here? What does this impact us? in the depth dimension of our lives, in the spiritual dimension, the religious dimension. So here, Teilhard de Chardin, I think, offers some very interesting insights to this new materialism. He did ask the question in the early 20th century, who will give evolution its own God? That is an important question in light of a post-Einsteinian universe. So what Teilhard recognized is that he wanted to reframe things and say we need to get out of this kind of notion of static being or a metaphysics of being, as if there's an eternal being that remains unchanging. In his view, and which is consonant with process thinking, the whole, including God, is in movement, moving toward more being, more something more together. And this is also consonant with modern science itself, that there is no such thing as space and time. It is space-time is what the whole universe is in its unfolding. So matter is this ongoing differentiation of the world, constantly, in a sense, matter performatively materializing time and space. And we can't get our heads around that, quite honestly, because we still live on the everyday life in a Newtonian world. And so we just have stuff. We have computers and lamps and desks. It's very hard for us to get down to that basic level of really what's going on in the hidden world of nature. So Teilhard speaks of a metaphysics of union. And he says that we must change our geometry to realize that what comes first is not being, but union. That notion is very consonant with modern science. It's actually consonant with technology itself, that we can become something more by merging with our devices, by creating things that can lead us towards something new. So what Teilhard says is not a consciousness of being, but a consciousness of union and movement. Now, what's interesting here, and it's implicit, is that if I had a lot more time, there is actually, I think, a biblical way of looking at this whole thing. And maybe just putting it in shorthand, we can look at this whole movement of becoming in and with technology in light of incarnation, in light of the fact that matter is not static, and from a biblical perspective, it never was. The whole of Scripture is a narrative of God, being part of this world that is moving toward its fulfillment. And of course, Teilhard picks that up and speaks of Omega. God is that principle within nature, that presence within nature that gives vitality to everything that exists, or what he called the élan vital. Yet while God is within nature, God is more than nature. God is not nature, right? Otherwise we'd be in pantheism. And yet what he's saying is that nature has both an immanent power of newness and yet a transcendence to it. There's something that is moving it forward towards more than itself. And so he speaks about God Omega as the infinite depth and breadth and future of the material world, which is, of course, kind of, what Scripture is saying as well, right? God is deeply, one, in a sense, unified in that Word become flesh, and something new is taking place here even in this life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So the newness, I think, of the material world is what incarnation is essentially about. And so Teilhard puts this into the framework of this unfolding universe to say God Omega, or this power of divine love, is moving this universe towards something new, more whole, together. And he speaks about the energies of love. Love, he says, is the basic energy of the universe. Love that attracts, unites, creates, and transcends. And where there's love, there's the evermoreness of life, and there's God. So he says God has become too small to desire to go on living to a higher plane. He says that our God is too old, too stuck, too static. He says science now tells us the cosmos has become a cosmogenesis, a birthing of a universe. And he said this must lead to us to change the structure, not only of our thought, but of our beliefs. So it's an incarnational universe. And I do think technology technologists would never in a million years admit this, but they are pointing to an incarnational universe where God and the world are in the process of becoming something more together, because the universe is grounded in a personal center of God, of Omega, of a power of love. And so Teilhard spoke about God coming to birth in the heart of matter when consciousness awakens to this power of love. And so what he sees is that evolution is a process of God and world becoming something more together. God and the material world, incarnation, God becoming conscious and becoming completed in directed evolution. And of course, this opens up all sorts of new ideas and of course questions, and certainly in light of classical theism. But theogenesis is what Teilhard really sees at the heart of our universe, moving from cosmological life to biological life to now this new life of computer technology that we call noogenesis, or the life of the mind. Teilhard sees this whole trajectory as Christogenesis, that the whole thing is a body of divinity, humanity, materiality becoming ever more complexified and might say unified through a new power of consciousness and love. And so, he said, our success will not be determined by survival of the fittest, but by our own capacity to converge and unify. That is a statement that is very consonant with technology today. We have the capacity now to become something more together than we have ever been in the history of humankind. And so Teilhard wrote on technology in his essays of the future of man, and he saw the role of technology as one of convergence. It can gather us, drawing us together, minds, forming a new collective mind, a new global consciousness, which is basically what we're on the cusp of today, right? We know what's going on today in the world at the touch of a button. And what Teilhard would hope is that the collective mind will also give rise to a collective heart, a new power, a new sense of compassion in the world, a new sense of love that would unite us. And so he speaks not of transhumanism, right? Transhumanism in its radical implications wants to move beyond the human person as something that is that we can discard, the biological body as just a prosthesis that helps the mind work. Posthumanism is saying, no, we can become something more with our devices. And Teilhard builds on the posthuman idea, the new materials idea, and say we are to become ultra-human, more deeply human, not other than human. And so he says it's not perfection of being through artificial means, rather evolution is toward more being. Yes, we can get better health through technology, we can live longer, but it's not about well-being. If technologies does not increase spirituality and a consciousness of love, a consciousness of God in our midst, then it will have failed us. And so what we need today, and this is my bottom line, transhumanism and human becoming cannot really become anything more whole, more vital, and move toward life abundant without incorporating religion into technology. As Hefner says, if we cannot imagine that religion takes shape in technology, then we have eliminated the religious depth dimension of the most significant development in human becoming. But this is exactly where we are today. We're on the cusp of rapid technological development. Those of you who keep up know we are on the cusp of the metaverse. We will be living in virtual fields of reality in a very short amount of time. And we have religion marginalized, individualized. We don't know where God might fit into this whole thing, other than if we say that God is the creator of it all. And that's not really helpful at this point. People are yearning to go beyond, to find a God who is at the heart of our own creativities and development. And so I think one, believe it or not, one kind of modern prophet here was the communications expert and media expert, Marshall McLuhan, who was a devout Catholic, who actually had very profound insights on computer technology and religion. And he said, with computer technology, we could proceed from translating languages to bypassing them entirely in favor of an integral cosmic unconsciousness. The computer holds out the promise of a technologically engineered state of universal understanding and unity, a state of absorption in the logos that could knit mankind into one family and create a perpetuity of collective harmony and peace. Psychic communal integration made possible by the electronic media could create the universality of consciousness foreseen by Dante when he predicted that we would continue as not more than broken fragments until they were unified into an inclusive consciousness. The mystical body of Christ, the ultimate extension of man. That is a very powerful insight that would take more time to unpack. But I think Teilhard said the same thing. He said he saw this whole movement of biological, cosmological, and now we can say panpsychic life as the building up of Christ today. And, we can speak of it as a cosmotheandric wholeness. And that is, in a sense, the Pauline notion of the body of Christ. Even the notion that our sufferings make up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. There's something about us that is contributing to this fulfillment of the body of Christ, the whole of what creation is intended, you might say, or what Scotus would call the primacy of love, ever since the beginning, that love has always intended that the Christ come to this fullness at the heart of created life. And so, translating this into our own genre, our own key of computer technology, transhumanism, we can say we are part of a creative whole of unlimited potential, whereby God, self, and world are constantly being drawn into a new existence together. And, isn't that what Corinthians says? Eye has not seen, ear has not heard all that God has prepared for those who live in the wellspring of love. And so we do have, in a sense, some decisions to make, some choices to make, some new thinking to do. Because right now we're on a cusp of a technological trajectory. We can move into a very strange and dystopic future where we will build androids and robots to replace humans, as we have robotic cars now right around the corner, where we're displacing humans from the workforce because of robots. Where, if you've seen the movie Ex Machina, where we'll fall in love with robots, where we'll be, uploading our brains. And that gets very toward what? What are we doing with the technology? Or we can use technology with a religious sensibility, with a sense that God is at the heart here, that God is doing new things in and through our own creative efforts. And we might say, build a better earth, an earth that is more wholesome, more just and equitable, an earth that might be more unified. And so two paths diverge in the strange world of technology. And right now, I think the choice is up to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Ilia, for that remarkable presentation. And here to respond is Nicholas Sparks. Nicholas is a doctoral student and instructor in philosophy and bioethics at St. Louis University. His research centers on the human person in Catholic and continental thought, as well as philosophy of technology, ethics, and metaphysics. He is currently writing his dissertation, developing a traditional Catholic account of human nature in conversation with Martin Heidegger's philosophy of technology. He is working on papers on the ontology and ethics of gift, transhumanism, and lifespan enhancement research. Nicholas earned his master's at Florida State University in 2018 and his bachelor's at Benedictine College in 2015. When he is not teaching and writing, he spends time with his wife and family, taking walks, visiting museums, and trying to perfect his barbecue recipes. Without further ado, I give you Nicholas Sparks. Nicholas, take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the chance to be here and speak with you all today. If this was an in-person event, I would offer to do a book signing since I do share a name with the romance author, for those of you who know them, but hopefully this will be just fine. So again, really enjoyed Sister Ilia's presentation, and obviously there's enough material there to cover in a few books, which I believe she has done. So I'm going to try to focus on just a few aspects of what Sister Ilia presented on. So first I want to start by kind of tracing some common ground and echoing Sister Ilia and talking about what posthumanism has to teach the Christian and the Catholic tradition. And then I want to kind of raise 4 areas of concern related to the presentation. So one concerns kind of the, 2 of them concern the conception of nature and kind of the fundamental nature of the universe. One of them concerns kind of the status of cyborgization, cybernetics. And then I want to kind of close with the question, who's posthumanism and which subject? I want to ask there, to what extent are the advancements that posthumanism secures already anticipated in the pre-modern Christian tradition? So first, what does posthumanism have to teach us? Well, I want to focus on kind of 3 themes and contrast posthumanism with the humanism that it follows, which is Enlightenment humanism. So first off, I want to talk about Enlightenment anthropology and the theme of relationality. So many of the problems of modern and Enlightenment philosophy concern bridging the gap back from the isolated individual subject, or I, and either the political and social community or the universe. Whereas posthumanism emphasizes our embeddedness in relationships, both among other humans and non-human life as well. And so I think posthumanism provides a helpful corrective to the kind of atomistic and individualistic tendencies in Enlightenment humanism. Also, I think it provides a helpful corrective in terms of considering the importance of materiality. So likewise, the body and material culture are by and large underemphasized as subjects of serious concern in mainstream Enlightenment thought. And when they are treated, they are treated as obstacles to thought or to willing, or as occasions for deception, illusion, and the like. Whereas posthumanism emphasizes our embeddedness in and dependence on materiality. And then finally, modern and Enlightenment thought kind of systematically overlooks its own historical embeddedness, which leads, among other things, to the failure of Enlightenment morality proclaimed by Friedrich Nietzsche, whereas posthumanism emphasizes our embeddedness in historical circumstance and in culture. And so I think the emphasis on relationality, on material embeddedness, and historical embeddedness are all ways in which the Christian, the Catholic tradition can benefit from engagement with posthumanism and can help further kind of work our way out of the snare that thinking through Enlightenment categories tends to foist upon us. So let's talk then about what nature amounts to. So in her article, Is Artificial Intelligence Artificial?, which we talked a little bit about in Sister Ilia's presentation, Sister Ilia draws on a reading of Martin Heidegger in The Question Concerning Technology. And she says, Martin Heidegger described nature as a standing reserve, that is, the pluripotentiality of being itself. The prefix techne is the act or art of bringing forth from nature. And Heidegger suggested that technology is, quote, a revealing that rules, a challenging which puts to nature the unreasonable demand that it supplies energy which can be extracted and stored as such. Now, this kind of unconcealment orders everything to stand by, to be ready at hand, to be rendered as a standing reserve. In other words, nature does not exist as a thing, but everything that exists is a standing reserve to be set upon. And in other words, nature exists only for us to kind of extract energy or power from it. Now, this is part of Heidegger's understanding of nature, but we have to kind of situate it more broadly in his understanding of technology. Now, Heidegger suggests that it's modern technology that turns nature into a standing reserve, but this isn't true of all technology. and we should be clear not to confuse this understanding of technology with nature itself. So what he also says in the question concerning technology is this: physis, or nature, the arising of something from out of itself, for example, an oak tree from an acorn, is a bringing forth, a poiesis. Physis is indeed poiesis in the highest sense. For what comes to presence by means of physis has the eruption belonging to bringing forth in itself. In contrast, what is brought forth by techne, or by art, has the eruption belonging to bringing forth not in itself, but in another, the craftsman or the artist. And the revealing that holds sway throughout modern technology, Heidegger says, doesn't unfold into a bringing forth in the sense of poiesis or physis. This revealing is a challenging, again, which puts to nature the unreasonable demand that it supply energy, which can be extracted and stored as such. And so for Heidegger, there's actually, in the relationship between modern technology and nature, an adversarial or combative relationship. And so it's not the case that Heidegger thinks that nature is a standing reserve without qualification. Rather, he thinks that modern technology has framed our relationship with nature in such a way that it can only appear to us as a standing reserve. It can only appear to us as pure potential to supply us with energy. But Heidegger says elsewhere that this kind of obscures a more primal truth about nature that can be revealed to us only when we let it reveal itself to us out of its physis, out of its nature. And so this, I think, brings up the important issue that technology, as Sister Ilia says, isn't a mere means. It's not simply a collection of objects or assemblages, but in fact, technology is hermeneutic. And by hermeneutic, we mean it inframes, it shapes, it begets a certain understanding of its object. So that brings us to the next question, which is kind of this computational or informational hermeneutic of nature. And so Sister Ilia, again in this article, is, I take it, trying to say that artificial intelligence actually isn't that artificial because information goes all the way down in nature. For example, neurons are processors in the brain. The immune system operates adaptively on the basis of complex computations. There are kind of complicated information exchanges that occur within and between animals. So coded information, Sister Ilia says, is embedded in physical reality and is integral to many natural processes. And I don't want to get too far afield on this point, but I do want to bring attention to the fact, to this kind of in light of the previous point, that the informational and computational understanding of nature is in fact a hermeneutic. It's a way of taking technologies that we are familiar with and using them to render nature intelligible to us. This is a perfectly normal and natural feature of human inquiry. This goes back to the Middle Ages, which saw nature as a book, right? A book written by God. And a book, again, even though it's not seen as high-tech for us, is still a form of technology. But the point being that we use our familiarity with the technologies that we develop actually to render nature intelligible to us. So it's not the case that the neurons are straightforwardly processors, or that the immune system straightforwardly functions on the basis of computations. This is a way of helping us to render these phenomena, these features of our life and our bodies intelligible to us and helping to do science with them. But it is a hermeneutic endeavor. We're bringing technological language and metaphors to bear. And I guess a few other examples to make this a little more clear. We use the language, say, of blowing off steam when we talk about coming down from being angry. Well, the language of blowing off steam really operates on the assumption that we operate like locomotives, where if you build up enough steam, what you have to do is let the cap off the thing and allow the steam to escape before it boils over. So our language is really shot through with technological metaphors. And while they're illuminating, while they're the necessary way that we have to try to make sense of the world, we can't lose sight of the fact that they are metaphors. So I want to focus now on this kind of transition to the post-human. So, channeling Donna Haraway, Sister Ilia says, the post-human signals a new type of relational person, emerging in and through electronic embeddedness. The term post-human describes a material, informational entity whose boundaries undergo continuous construction and reconstruction. The post-human signifies a dynamic partnership between humans and intelligent machines, replacing the liberal humanist subject's manifest destiny to dominate and control nature. And so we move here to a more capacious understanding of the human person as a life system, capable of integrating machinery and technological interfaces and extending and embedding our lives and activities electronically. But what I want to ask is whether this is a particularly new phenomenon. So I want to kind of talk about this under two aspects, augmentation and exteriorization. If you look in the anthropological and paleological record, these are actually timeless features of the human species, even if we are continually developing new modalities of augmentation and exteriorization. One example is that there's pretty good evidence we have from paleoanthropology and kind of some neuroscientific studies we've been able to do on the basis of experiments in paleoanthropology that are distinctly human cognitive capacities for abstract reasoning, for language, and for complex action prediction depend upon the emergence of sophisticated tool use and tool making. And so there's a very clear-cut connection between our ability to fashion material tools and a different sort of cognitive activity, a different sort of cognitive architecture that gets forged and reinforced through repeated activity. And so you might say, the kind of clearest or most early examples are simply of stone tools like axes, knives, flints, and things like that. Well, these are all plainly ways of augmenting our natural deficiencies. Right? We're not able to make fire on our own naturally. We don't have really a thick hide of fur. We don't hibernate. And we aren't naturally the strongest or most well-equipped to defend ourselves. And so we need to fashion tools for ourselves to help provide for those functions that animals naturally have. And so the process of augmentation is kind of there from the very start in human development. Human development just is the history of augmenting ourselves in ways that other animals don't need to, really. And likewise with exteriorization. Right? So one thing that can get lost when we think about technologies is how much we rely on them. And you might not realize how much you rely on your technology until your phone dies or your computer is broken. Sometimes it's tough even to think, to remember, and to function without certain technologies. And this is because we actually offload a lot of our, for example, memory into phones. So instead of having to remember what number to dial on the rotary phone, now you can just have phone numbers from hundreds or thousands of people saved on your iPhone. This helps reduce the cognitive load on us greatly, although there's different sorts of compensation we have to account for. But there is a great deal of exteriorization that happens in human life. So we externalize memory in the form of using technologies to help us remember things. This is why books are important. And exteriorization isn't simply instrumental in that way. It's also a way of just kind of making sense of ourselves. So along with the emergence of stone tools in early human history, one of the earliest things that we see in human communities is art, drawings. And so there's this natural tendency to express ourselves in what we would see as cultural manifestations very early on. So what I would say is that augmentation and exteriorization are actually timeless features of what it means to be human. And so it doesn't follow that simply because we have these new technologies, one example would be something like a brain-computer interface or a deep brain simulation. These are both like sorts of medical technology that we can use to help people communicate, navigate strokes and seizures and things like that. It doesn't follow that we have kind of, just because we have particularly intimate or sophisticated technologies that we are integrating into our bodies or into which we're projecting ourselves, that we're dealing with ontologically or metaphysically new ground. And so if it's the question that this is simply a new manifestation of a timeless feature of human nature, then I think what follows is that the questions we should be asking are ethical in a broad sense. So one important question is to ask whether a largely electronically embedded and mechanically mediated life is a good one for humans to live, such that it contributes to our proper end. And what I wanted to end on is asking this question: to what extent does the pre-Enlightenment Christian tradition already anticipate and embody the characteristics of posthumanism that we've discussed so far? In other words, who's posthumanism, or who's humanism, and which subject are we talking about? And so there are three themes I want to focus on. I want to focus on personhood, being, and relationality, the dependence of kind of our spiritual faculties or thought or willing on materiality, and on the integrity of nature. So as to the first point, I think that in the Christian tradition is actually kind of foundational for a deeply relational understanding of metaphysics or ontology. So in the first case, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, God is supposed to be ipsum esse subsistens, being itself. Well, it turns out that being itself, or the highest being, is in fact relational being. So it's not simply the fact that we are monotheists in the Christian tradition. We believe in one God with three divine persons, and so there's a complex interplay between substance or nature and relationality here. But what I think we can draw out of this is the fact that to be a substance, if we kind of mine the Christian tradition deeply enough, is to be in relation, because in fact the highest substance, the highest being, is intrinsically relational. And we can trace this to work to the theological writings of the Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. This is a plausible reading of Aquinas' theology and metaphysics, as well as Augustine's. So I think this has deep roots both in the modern, the medieval, and the classical Christian traditions. I want to turn then to the Imago Dei. So kind of one of the most famous things that you can draw from Scripture that even non-believers know is that we're supposed to be created in the image and likeness of God, the Imago Dei. Well, I don't think that, and I don't think the majority of the Christian tradition thinks that the Imago Dei is something that simply applies to the individual. For starters, the immediate verse following the creation of man is, in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And so there's this intrinsic relationality even to the Imago Dei, I think. And then finally, although it's a different kind of sense of relationality, creation itself is ordered to, it's created for the glory of God. And this is a familiar theme from Dante, from Aquinas, all the way back through the Christian tradition, that we are created to share in beatitude, in the divine life. And so we are created for relation with God. This is kind of fundamental, and this is what Christ comes to restore us to. Comes to restore us to relation to God that has been lost. So I think a close reading of the Christian tradition actually yields a pretty rich sense in which being is relational. And so I think this is an important point at which the Christian tradition and the post-human tradition intersect. So turning then to thought and willing and their dependence on materiality, well, for most of the pre-modern Christian tradition is what we call hylomorphic. And hylomorphism, it's handy, right? Because it simply means matter formism, if you want it to be quite literal. So hylo comes from hule in the Greek, which originally means literally just kind of a chunk of wood, but more metaphorically, it's the matter or the substrate of the thing. And morphe refers to the shape, or as Aristotle said, the form of a thing. And so on a hylomorphic understanding of reality, or of material reality, all things are composed of matter and form. And a thing's form can't function without its requisite matter. I can't have a sacramental chalice without some metal or wood out of which to forge it. You can't have a human being without a human body, or at least certain parts of the human body. And so deep in the Christian tradition is, despite some of the Platonic influences, a very deep understanding of the dependence of mind on body. To the extent that one can't think or will without certain bodily prerequisites. And I think kind of the flip side would also be true, that mind in a sense emerges from matter, although the sense in which that's true, I think, is a tricky one to nail down. And finally, I want to focus on the integrity of nature. And so while we are the pinnacle of creation, we are the creation of man and woman is what completes the creation narrative in Genesis. And we're given to creation in the form of a garden. We're given dominion or control over it. I think what the tale of Genesis suggests is that our work in the cosmos is a work of knowing and of cultivating, and not of subjugating things. That is to say that that our fates are tied up with the fate of creation. It's not simply a form of raw material that we ought to exploit for our own interests, but our fate is inseparably intertwined with the fate of creation. And so instead of understanding the human subject, or the human person, as someone who can flourish pretty much without any dependence on the natural world, we need to recover an understanding that both posthumanism and Christianity give us of the necessity of our care for the world and also our dependence on it. So I'd like to wrap up then with just actually there's probably a little too much there to wrap up with. So I'm just gonna go ahead and finish right there. I want to thank Sister Ilia again for her great presentation. It was a pleasure to hear her speak. I want to thank again all the folks from ITEST for putting this together. It's been wonderful, and thank you all for listening.
Well, thank you, Nicholas, for giving us something wonderful to listen to. So with that, we will open the question and answer session. This is a time when, for the next half hour, when you can ask questions of the two presenters and have those questions answered in real time with no intermediaries, except, of course, the intermediary of the mediated communication instrument within which we are currently communicating. So Sheila Roth is going to be our moderator. Sheila, if you'll spotlight your camera.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. All right, our first question is to Sister Ilia. Can transhumanism achieve its aims?
Well, yes and no. I mean, some of the aims are already being achieved, but I think the ultimate aims, I would say, if they do, it's going to be a heavy price to pay. I think we're going to see radical changes in human community. I think it would just change the whole matrix of the earth. So look, transhumanism there's a lot, millions of dollars being poured into transhumanist research and to developing technologies with transhumanist aims. So will they be achieved? Look at the meta the metaverse, which is right around the corner. Quantum computing is changing everything very rapidly. And so, quite honestly, from a biological perspective, our human brains are old. They can only handle so much information. And I think a world of quantum computing and advanced technology will almost impel some of the transhumanist ideals to be realized. So I can't say for certain, but I can say that we are definitely on that trajectory.
All right, thank you very much. We have another question. How does postmodernism relate to this topic?
Yeah, I think postmodernism certainly is a reaction to modernity. It's very complex. Postmodernism is a rubric that covers a series of paradigm shifts, if we can use that term, certainly coming out of the, and here I would say the modern liberal subject that was at the heart, very anthropocentric subject at the heart of 20th century and late 19th century, 20th century movements, including a lot of the violence of the 20th century. Postmodernism rejected meta-narratives. It doesn't, basically it comes back to that question of relativism. In other words, my truths, my beliefs are mine, maybe not yours, but it engages plurality, it engages religious plurality, cultural plurality. And so I think in some ways, postmodernism does have some strands of the new materialism, is it? The permeability of boundaries, the fact that, things are assemblages that can be formed and reformed. But it also has a new emphasis on community and ecology. So postmodernism, let me just say, to answer the question, it has strands of posthumanism and new materialism in it, but in itself, it's a complex shift in relation to modernity.
Okay, thank you. Nicholas, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, postmodernism is a very broad umbrella, right? So we could ask about literary postmodernism, postmodern theologies, postmodern philosophies, but I think Sister Ilia hit it right on the head.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Please reflect on the reality in our times that human beings are identifying their sexuality in more complex differentiations than the binary male-female in light of your presentations.
Yeah, well, I mean, quite honestly, one of my working theories, although I did not put this in here, is that the use of computer technology. So when we connect through our technologies, social media or email, we don't see persons, but we do share information. And so the lines of what we might call the ontological lines of distinction that were more definable and visible when we didn't have technology, when we would meet people, face to face, we could say, oh, yes, you're a nice woman, or yes, you're a nice man. But in a world of shared information, I think those ontological distinctions have become blurred, and we have developed sort of a new consciousness of identity based on shared information. I think that goes hand in hand with the new materialisms of ongoing construction and performativity. In other words, I am what I act, or the acting person. And so identities, and I think this is, certainly moving away from kind of a biblical notion of gender, if we wanted to even use that. But the idea of gender as a construction, and here the work of Judith Butler is significant insofar as she was one of the first feminist philosophers to speak about gender as a social construction. That as soon as the baby's born, you paint the room blue if it's a boy and pink if it's a girl. So again, it's a culture, it's a nature culture continuum that gender has challenged and reformed itself in the permeability of space-time mattering, if I can use that term. So gender identity is an ongoing construction of identity rather than something that's ontologically given.
Oh, great, thank you. Nicholas, do you have any response to that?
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to get clear on the distinction between sexuality and gender, right? Because arguably the branching and the sundering actually traces back to what Sister Ilia said about the separation of the Cartesian subject from the body, right? Where one's experience can be kind of interrogated or asked after independently of one's bodily givenness. That I think lays the groundwork for the distinction between gender and sexuality, since gender is, at least in part, aside from social performance or construction, a matter of one's experience of one's sexuality.
Okay, thank you. Another question. How does the collectivist element of posthumanism address the irreducibility of the human person present in Christian personalism?
I think it would be a mistake to see this as a collapse of the person into some kind of collective beingness. I think that's not, in a sense, what Teilhard, one of Teilhard's famous maxims is that union differentiates. The more I am in union with another, the more I am myself, since it's the core of myself, that's the basis of union. And I think, it's like any a collective, and in fact, the word collective is not a good word here because it does sound like a mass, sort of a collapse of distinction of personhood into this kind of, mass of beingness, almost in a Marxian sense, like the mass of the people. But it really is about, and this goes actually hand in hand with the identity question. It's about ongoing identity as a type of development or process of personhood. So so the word that I use is hyper-personal. So rather than a collective, it's an ongoing becoming of myself by going beyond myself, where information, computer technology, sharing ideas with a larger whole can help me grow as a person. And as I grow as a person, I participate ever more in this ongoing movement of of this body developing in the world. So it's not an either or. It's not person versus community, or I lose myself if I become, a post-human. It's rather it's what we might say a dialectic of personhood and community. And I think, one thing I think we do have to be careful about, a caveat, is what I see a lot with young people today is there is a kind of dualism that can take place. In other words, I can be mentally in all deals with all my friends, but my body, is here. And I think we can lose personhood with technology. And so it's not a given that we will develop who we are in identity. We can be absorbed into the multiple realms of information. And that's why I do agree that we need some kind of ethics or boundaries in the development of it.
Okay, great. Nicholas, do you have a response, or should I go to the next?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with emphasizing it as an ethical or a social question. To be a person or to be a human is just to be in relationship to a broader community. But the question then is, how is it that we treat the others with whom we're in community such that we respect the irreducibility and the incommunicability of their own personhood is, I think, the question. So.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Here's a question for Nicholas. Can you elaborate more on the relevance of the Book of Nature?
Yes. So the point that I was making in bringing up the Book of Nature is that the technologies that we operate with shape our vision of nature, and so technological changes can lead to changes in our vision of nature. So where before nature was seen, as a book, as something that had an intrinsic intelligibility to it, an intelligibility that wasn't just reducible to mathematics, you have a certain vision of nature as the product of an author. Right? Once you get to this transition to modern science, where Descartes, Locke, Boyle, and others are advancing a new idea, and I guess Bacon too, Francis Bacon, are advancing a new vision of what it means to do science. There's this emphasis on reducing scientific explanation to mathematical explanation, mechanical mathematic explanation, which gives you a very different understanding of what the world is and how we ought to understand our place in it. So the sort of technologies that we have available to us shape our understanding of the world, and then kind of paradoxically, the way that we understand the world shapes the technologies that we design and the way we understand ourselves. There's this complex feedback loop between what we understand nature to be and how we design ourselves to kind of relate to it, where there's this kind of feedback loop that can either benefit us greatly or trap us in very unhealthy and exploitive relationships with nature.
All right, very good. Sister Ilia, do you have a response to that?
To the book of nature. I mean, it's a classical medieval idea, you know, and I agree with what Nicholas was saying. You know, it's an ongoing. I guess I would see nature. I would have slightly different views on nature with what Nicholas was offering us before. The word itself is an ambivalent. It's an umbrella term. So I am careful about using. I don't use the word nature very much, precisely because it's just an umbrella term for now what we know from the sciences, a whole host of understandings of how existence, or what we call the stuff of life, really works. So, I mean, just for an example, Teilhard de Chardin uses 28 different versions of nature in his writing. So I would warrant against having this kind of objective idea of nature, or this kind of collective idea of nature, when I think that's it's elusive idea, because it just tells me that nothing's really being said here. It's just an abstract concept, and nature is not abstract if we're really reflecting on the stuff of existence, you know, and what we are. And that is, again, from the sciences, and again, as people reflect on the scientific, you know, understandings of nature, it's very dynamic, it's relational, you know, and some of the things that Nicholas was talking about. But I guess I would take a much more sober approach to nature, rather than thinking we know exactly what this book of nature might be.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. How does genetic engineering relate to transhumanism?
Very much so. That is very much a part of it. That is, in fact, genetic engineering is one of the transhumanist sciences that's taking place today, that we can alter the genetic code. We can slice and insert genes. We can delete genes. And that, I think, is, you know, it's scary, quite honestly. We have the power, in a sense, we have the tools, and including with those tools, in a sense, the power to alter human life. And that is where the ethical question is paramount. I mean, who is going to play God here? You know, who is going to decide? It can be a form of eugenics. You know, we can, if we can really intercede in the genetic code, and then who's not to say that we will, you know, engineer a world. And that is, you know, today the term is biohacking. We can literally hack into the human person. So the human, I mean, even I think, what's his name? The guy who wrote Homo Deus, Harari, you know, says that, you know, the human, as we've known the human, really, it's a whole different world here, precisely because we have tools that can literally modify and change the human person. And so proceed cautiously. And in my view, I think any technology should have philosophers and theologians at the table before they decide to make any tool. Otherwise, we are left really at the whims of technologists.
Right, there's a lot at stake there. Nicholas, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, and when you couple this technology with a certain kind of naive utilitarianism that it seems like a lot of technologists have, a lot of transhumanists that I've read think that genetic editing, genetic engineering is actually going to come to be a moral imperative as soon as it becomes more widely accessible. You actually are obligated to design the best children you can, or else you're morally failing them, which itself again has eugenic roots. So.
All right, here's another question or a statement first. Sister Lucille Randon turned on February 18th, or on February 11th, excuse me, turned 118 years old and is the second oldest person in the world behind the Japanese Kane Tanaka, who is 119. What does living long in a transhuman world mean for us?
Yeah, it's not living long, it's living forever, actually. So digital immortality really has the goal of reversing the death, what they call the death barrier. So it's called digital immortality. That's the term that's used today. So living long, and the lifespan is increasing. I mean, it's already increased, right in our own time with modern medicine and biotechnology. So we'll continue to increase. So living to 100 will be probably no big deal, but it's problematic for the earth, which has limited resources. And that is one of the, so we have to, with technology, you have to think creatively, they think creatively and imaginatively. So digital brain downloading, for example, which is part of digital immortality, one aspect of it, as Martine Rothblatt describes in her book on digital immortality, is that if I can download my brain into another medium, into a computer file, and I upload that file into a new medium, I don't necessarily have to live as a terrestrian anymore. A downloaded or digitally immortal existence can be now a kind of cosmic or universal existence. I may occupy other aspects of the cosmos. So I know this sounds really like outlandish to us, but this is actually part of the imaginative creativity of this movement of digital immortality. So quite honestly, living to 100 and 119, that's like, well, Abraham, I guess he did that too, but we're talking about really, it's just not just extending the lifespan, which is part of it, but really overcoming the death barrier and just living kind of this eternal conscious existence.
Wow, it's something else. What do you have to say about that, Nicholas?
So I would say like digital immortality is probably the gold standard of what transhumanists are trying to achieve. Some other kind of more mundane projects, you have lifespan researchers who are trying to either extend health span or extend lifespan. So it might be the case with in health span extension that we can't substantially prolong human life beyond, say, 80 or 100, but we can keep you healthy until like 79 or 99. So that's one goal for some lifespan extension researchers. And then another kind of more radical goal is pushing human lifespan to maybe 120, 150, see how far we can push that. But then I think the gold standard that they're shooting for in the transhumanist camp is let's just forget the body altogether, at least for right now, and shoot for digital immortality.
Yeah, I think, and I would agree with you, Nicholas, there. And I think, digital life extension along with gene editing. So you have to take these things together. You can't just take them separate. Really, we're talking about a world of eugenics. In a sense, there are certain people who will live on, in this world. And there'll be people who will be collateral damage, like the poor, for example, who can't afford the technology. So if you can't afford the technology and it's not, readily accessible to all peoples around the world, you can begin to see how populations will shift and who will survive. So it does have a lot of moral implications, quite honestly.
Yes, it does. Another question. In your opinion, how should we as Catholics view transhumanism's notion of human-directed intelligent evolution, moving from Homo sapien to technosapien with regard to our being created in the image and likeness of God?
Yeah, and again, I was trying to get at that very briefly, but I had so much in a short amount of time. I do think, and this would be my approach, would be to, I would take an incarnational approach. In other words, really consider the incarnation as the starting point, in a sense, the primacy of Christ, which is part of the Catholic tradition, since its inception, basically with Irenaeus of Lyon, through Duns Scotus into Rahner, etc. So it's biblical. It's probably even more biblical than, the doctrine of original sin. So in other words, the incarnation, or Christ as that which has been intended from all, in the mind of God. And then how do we develop technologically, which is what Marshall McLuhan was really aiming at. He's saying that, in his view, computer technology, and I think McLuhan would agree, like even some of the developments of transhumanism, as Terry was saying, can enhance the development of the body of Christ. But so we're not talking about something abstract. Incarnation is very concrete. God is involved in history, in materiality. Either God is involved or God is not. You can't have, and otherwise you have some kind of distortion of the incarnation. And I think that's the thing. We don't think incarnationally about technology, and maybe that's what I would like to see more of.
Okay, thank you. Nicholas, do you have a response?
Yes, I think, part of what I wanted to argue earlier is that this electronic and technological embodiment is just an extension of the timeless human quest to augment and exteriorize ourselves. So in a sense, it's nothing essentially new. It's a new manifestation of the fact that we've always gone to technology to supplement our needs and to try to extend our capacities. That being said, oh, sorry, did you want to chip in?
What you're presenting is actually one school of thought. There's actually another school of thought, which Ernst Kopp developed in the 19th century. Yeah. So in other words, technology, not just as a prosthetic, right? Just to enhance our movement, but actually as a reflection, it's a human extension of what we are. So it's not, so there's a difference between the substance of personhood that uses a tool to enhance what it is, or that personhood itself being extended. That's the cybernetics of it, right? It's not just that it's helping us, it's actually changing us. And I guess that's the other school of thought. That's all I'm just saying. So there are several schools of thought here. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, and actually, I think So I would agree with both of this. So I don't think it's just a matter of kind of this external aid. I think that wouldn't be true to the Heideggerian insights that I think are valid. But like I said, I think it kind of reduces back to, in a sense, an ethical question, right? Is that let's grant the fact that this is technologically possible, and let's grant the fact that it's not just kind of directly contrary to human nature. Nevertheless, right, what are the ethical values that we need to consider when we think about maybe this putative transition to the technosapient? And those will include thinking about ourselves as creatures, right? And so what is our proper goal? What is our proper status as creatures? How do we embody and exhibit the virtues, and how would a change in our social or individual condition affect our ability to exercise the virtues, sort of grow in love with Christ? So I think there's some complicated ethical questions there that really kind of get to the heart of Catholic spirituality and ethics. But I think I'd be a little more reluctant to say that the transition from Homo sapien to techno sapien is straightforwardly compatible with the Catholic tradition, at least without kind of some clever maneuvering. But I think that there are people out there who obviously can do that. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. What is the purpose of overcoming the death barrier? Is this a rejection of beatitude and our union with God? Is sin eliminated with transhumanism?
Yeah, again, those are interesting questions. And I think, implicitly, there's a book called Apocalyptic AI by Robert Gerasi, who speaks of the foundations of transhumanism in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And he does use some biblical texts, etc., to support these things. So the idea of overcoming sin through transhumanism, I think is actually implicit in it. That human betterment, just the term itself, or superhuman, means that maybe we can overcome some of these weaknesses that we have, some of these proclivities to to evil or to destruction. So I think implicitly the notion of overcoming sin is kind of written into some of that transhumanist agenda. And what was the other part? Sin and what else?
Is sin eliminated with transhumanism? And is this a rejection of beatitude in our union with God?
Oh, yeah. So, there are people who have written on cyber resurrection, cyber heaven. There is an ideal. So one thing that Ray Kurzweil says, and this is where, again, it's a very thin, if not a blurred line, that transhumanism technology gives us a new unfounded power. It's this idea that now we can be gods in our own way. And so there is this kind of replacement of, the biblical hope of heaven, or the biblical, trajectory of union with God is now replaced by technology. And that's, implicit in the, technology will fulfill what religion promises. Basically, they're saying religion, and by religion, they mean the Judeo-Christian tradition has failed to achieve the very aims that it proposes, and now technology will achieve those aims, which would include heaven and the resurrection and everything else.
Okay, good. Nicholas, do you have any input there?
I think that, yeah, I don't think I have anything to add just there.
Okay. This will be our last question, and then we'll close up. What value do you see in the use of science fiction movies to popularize and problematize transhumanism?
Yes, so I teach a course on technology and human personhood, so I use a lot of the movies in there. For one thing, I don't think we're consciously aware of how technology is really impacting human personhood, which I think the science fiction movies do for us. Movies like Transcendence, Ex Machina, AI, Elysium, or whatever. So I think it's coming, first of all, I think it's becoming consciously aware of how technology is affecting human personhood and human development. Second, I think technology, those movies, when we begin to see ourselves, because those movies become like a mirror for us. And I think we begin to see, I think we're frightened sometimes by what we see in those movies, and sometimes we're allured by it. So movies hold out images and possibilities, in terms of science fiction. Interestingly, some of that science fiction stuff, if you go back to Gattaca, back at one of the earliest AI movies on gene editing, or the way genes can be manipulated for personhood, some of that has come true. So science fiction writers, I find, are philosophers. And they are anticipating how technology can indeed shift and change human personhood and the consequences of that for our world. So I would suggest watching a few of those things, of those movies.
All right, thanks. How about you, Nicholas?
Yeah, I would entirely agree, and I think Gattaca is the first one that came to mind for me as well. But yeah.
Okay, very good. That will end our Q&A session, and I will turn it back over to Sebastian.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to these presentations, and thank you especially to Sister Ilia and to Nicholas for their contributions and their presence with us today. In conclusion of today's webinar, Father Vincent Uke, retired priest of the Diocese of Trenton, New Jersey, will offer our closing prayer, and then Sheila will close us out. Father Vincent?
God our Father, we thank you for the gift of our rational minds and the gift of revelation of mysteries of your divinity. May we learn to use these two great gifts to serve one another. May we accept ourselves as you made us, but also help us to repair the faults of nature rather than destroying them. May we direct our youth not into materialism and self-sufficiency, but into making our lives better, curing abnormalities found in nature while preserving human dignity. May we accept what we have not been able to repair for future generations, but to make improvements to enhance our love for those suffering. May we also marvel at the gift of life you have given to us and see your image carved into them, despite whatever challenges they may give us. Sensitize our scientists to care for humanity and our planet. Teach them humbly so that teach them humility so that they do not fall into the pride of Adam and Eve. Increase our faith in you so that with the help of your Son and the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to make all things new, they may focus on the promise of our resurrections at the end of time. Amen. And may the Lord be with you. And may Almighty God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.